Thank you very much for being with us tonight. It was really precious to see the film, and we are glad we can share it also with our guests, although of course it's maybe familiar to some of the local audiences. Before we let kind of all of you also ask some questions, I do want to pose maybe a few. So one of the things that struck me is that in the film you repeated twice, for me he's a hero. And I had a feeling that this was something which was important to emphasize. I wonder, also when you were growing up, there was obviously this line of family stories, but what about, let's say, more of a kind of public life of these kind of stories? Were the stories of partisans ever mentioned when you were growing up, let's say in school, or in kind of more public circles?
Well, thank you for inviting me and thank you for showing the film here. It's been a while since it has been shown in Vienna, and I'm really glad that it is shown again, and glad to be here. The partisan topic, my case is special since I'm Carinthian Slovene, and I was in a Slovene gymnasium, so there's all the pupils there came from Slovene families. They had similar histories. Not all of their relatives were deported to labor or concentration camps, but it was a different background. But even there, we knew about it, but it was not so much talked about it. And in Austria, the situation after 45 changed very quickly. The British, there was this anti-communist, the Cold War. So the British turned against their former collaborators, the partisans. So it was really hard for them, and after 45, the partisans in Austria were not called even partisans, they called them bandits. So the name, my aunt just said it for another film a while ago, they were called bandits till the 70s or 80s, and then it just started to call them partisans. And the public opinion is still, I would say, that the partisans did so many wrong things. So it's a really mixed up or a false view, but it's the common view here, yeah.
Connected to that, I'm very curious about the reception of the film. So obviously, I already mentioned the film got many awards. Mm-hmm. So I'm also curious, on one hand, on maybe, let's say, these more professional circles, but also, did it play in the cinemas? Did you also get a chance maybe to show it in Corinthia? What was somehow the kind of reaction to the film when you first showed it in Austria?
Well, at the Austrian film festivals, it was great because it was my first film. It's almost 20 years ago that I've made it, and I've made it with really no money, and I've made it mostly myself. So I didn't even think that the reactions on it would be so good, so great, because then it won so many awards at the Diagonale. It was shown at the Biennale, which is like the most important festival here. It won the award at the Film Academy Festival for Best. So many awards here, but of course this is a kind of educated artist group. So, and for example, in TV, it has never been shown. But I've tried, and some friends and supporters who liked the film and thought that would be important to show this film in TV, tried, and it wasn't even possible because we have a Slovene slot in Carinthia each Sunday. It's half an hour each Sunday. It's Slovene TV, and even there it was not possible to show it. So.
Do you see any changes in that? Because also, I mean, one of my next question is also about the movie you are working on or almost finished right now, which is also kind of a continuation of interest. But you did say that maybe somehow in the 70s and the 80s there was a little bit of change in the reception. And now, as you said, it's been 20 years from the film. Do you have a sense that this topic has been maybe approached differently? Do you also think that it has been, how would I say, looked at more in terms of artists or scientists or historians?
Yeah, I think like it has changed. there was not so many movies actually. I mean, you said it yourself, you were searching for movies about partisans in Austria, and you know there's so many special and sad stories if you start to research, but there's not so many films. Or I've made another one afterwards, The Kärntner spricht Deutsch, with Death as the Only Certain Fate. It's more oral history film because it was important to me to hear those voices and to hear the stories and to have those people to be heard and to a big public. But it has changed, and literature has helped. Of course, Maya Hadalab wrote a book which is very known in Austria. I think Handke has helped probably too, but literature has helped a lot. But still, I mean, you know the government that we have here. It has changed in some circles, but it's still not. The film that I'm doing now is dealing with the situation in Carinthia now, because the Slovene language is disappearing in Carinthia. I mean, I say it's disappearing. It's becoming less and less and less. Less people speaking Slovene, and I suppose like maybe in 20, 50 years it might disappear. But the situation now in Carinthia is the same, because 100 years after we had a referendum 100 years ago, whether this part of Carinthia is going to belong to Yugoslavia or to Austria. And most people voted for Austria, and most Carinthian Slovenes voted for Austria, because it was not national reasons why they voted for Austria, but Austria was a new democracy, and Yugoslavia was at that point the SHS monarchy. So this was also a reason, and it was also a reason because Klagenfurt was closer than Ljubljana was. So there were many reasons, but even after the referendum, some thousand Slovenes had to leave the country because they lost their jobs, they couldn't live there anymore. And this is a part of history that is not talked about until now. And to this 100 years anniversary of this referendum, they will still put up denkmäler.
Monument?
Thank you. Monuments for former Nazis. They put up new monuments for former Nazis, of which we know there were Nazis. There were strong agitators against the Slovenes. And they have put up new monuments. And if you go to Carinthia, there are those monuments everywhere.
Are there any monuments to the Slovenian partisans?
At the cemeteries. At the cemeteries you can find them, but not at public places and this kind. And often, like they're hidden even at the cemeteries. So the stones, like you have to search to find them. And there's one big one at the Bergman Museum. It's a museum in Eisenkappel, Железная Kappel. It's really in the mountains. And in my other film, The Kärntner spricht Deutsch, there's a part about it because there happened a really horrible massacre on the whole family. The whole family, even little children and babies and the grandparents were killed there by the Nazis. So it was a Slovene family who, like all Slovene families, did supported the partisans. Not all, but a lot of Slovene families supported the partisans. So that's why they were killed. Just shortly before the war ended, the whole family was killed. And there in the mountains, in the house where the family lived, there's a small museum on the history about the anti-fascist struggle in Carinthia. But it's the only museum in whole Austria. It's up there in the mountains. It's a private museum. And there's a big monument there. But it's just there in the mountains. There's no monument in Klagenfurt, not in Villach, no there.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your new film? So it's focused on the referendum?
The new film? Yeah. It started out because the historian Oliver Radkop, he's known here in Vienna. He asked me if I would work on a project with him about the history of the village I come from. And I started to think, okay, what's the most interesting thing about it? And like 100 years ago, 95% of the population spoke Slovene. And now it's maybe 5%. So in 100 years, from 95 to 5. So what happened? And starting from this question, it became a bigger film. So how is it possible that the language disappeared, or did all people stopped talking the language? So yeah, that's how the question started. And
thank you, Andrina. I have more questions, but it would be fair also to give you a chance. Is there any questions from the audience or comments on the film or something you want to ask, Andrina? We have another microphone for questions.
So, good evening. Hey.
now I see.
Yeah, so it isn't exactly a question, or maybe I want to start a little co-conversation. So I come from a land where communism government actually came to be. I'm from Bulgaria, and by us, the partisans weren't prosecuted or called bandits after the war. They were national heroes, and there are monuments all throughout the country for our Bulgarian partisans. But my question is, what would you rather? Partisans dying in a fight against fascism and not being remembered, or partisans dying in a fight against the monarchy, not strictly fascism, because fascism just wasn't present in Bulgaria, being called anti-fascists and being praised for being anti-fascists, while that wasn't their idea nor ideology. They were simply communist, I would say, partisans. There wasn't a German occupation in Bulgaria. Yep. The German army was on the border with Bulgaria. We were allied with Germany, allied under the 1,000 guns on the border, but still allied. So, yeah. Yeah, it's not a question, it's the start of a conversation, I'm sorry.
Well, it's hard to say something to that,
Yes,
because,
it is.
I'm not from Bulgaria. It's not a question, so what shall I say? What would I prefer? I mean, if they were allied, but I'm sorry, don't know anything about the situation in Bulgaria. But I can tell you something, like, fought for what they fought for, like, and they fought for communism, or because that's what you mentioned. Like in Carinthia, I mean, at first the language was forbidden, and the Slavs were there before even the German. In the 6th century, the Slavs were there before the German language came to Carinthia. But then Hitler came and the language was forbidden completely. And then people were deported just like this. So the reason why so many Carinthian Slovenes joined the partisans and supported the partisans were not so much this ideology, because they were all communists. They joined the partisans because the language was forbidden, because they were persecuted, and because their families were deported. There was, like, my great-granduncle, he was drafted into Wehrmacht. This happened to so many Slovenes. They had to fight for Wehrmacht, and their families were deported at the same time. So but what happened to them after the war and the Cold War came, it was said, like, you're all communists, and communists is the worst thing. So communist is even, like, I think this was the situation here in Austria and the British, like, communists is even worse than the Nazis were. So the Nazis could have their jobs again, and they did. Those people who deported people, who were responsible for the killing of so many people, were again in their former jobs, and all the others, the freedom fighters, were persecuted, under saying, okay, you're communist and communism is so bad. So that's what I can say to this.
So would you say that your partisans weren't simply anti-fascists, but they were fighting also for national identity?
Well, there's an element of a social revolution here, which I think is also very important. I mean, especially since Slovenian partisans were part of a, kind of transnational partisan movement, which was very strong in Yugoslavia. And here, it's also a question how we use the words, but communism also stood for a social revolution, which was a really important part, why it was felt as something so dangerous, and why it was also so heavily suppressed. And I think it's also important to say that one of the important elements of the socialist revolution is also that it really is trying to reach out to the ground, not necessarily as some kind of label that you have to ascribe to, but a certain set of values and social changes which were designed to, really change the lives of these people. So I think it's also not only what you subscribe for in terms of ideology or even awareness of ideology, but there was a very strong, kind of, how would I say, content of social revolution that I think was also very important for these people who were joining this fight. Paula,
I'm sorry, I would like to say one more thing, because what you just said, that's the problem. That was the problem for the Carinthian partisans a lot, because either it was said they're communists, it was said, okay, they just fought for their language. They fought because they wanted to become a part of Yugoslavia, which is both just not true. It was an anti-fascist struggle. And for this hasn't been recognized for a very, very long time. And the result is important. And the result was that so many SS troops had to come to Carinthia because the partisans were bombing trains, because they were doing so many things, and that the SS troops had to come to Carinthia, and that they were missing somewhere else. So it was a very effective fight. And as this, it has never been recognized. And now saying it was communist, or it was national, or it was for the language, or it was anti-fascist. So,
Carl, you also had a comment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrina, for this great film. I was also struck by one element that I haven't known before, like what you said, that after the war they were called bandits. And it's very famous that Nazis called partisan bandits during the war. So, it really confirms like this kind of absence of denazification process, in Austrian space. And the other one, that what I know is that many of these partisans didn't get any pensions, and the kind of being that their, political or military work was not recognized by Austrian state for till very, very long. But yeah, well, I don't have much to say. It's just like I'm a bit shocked about this, that they were named bandits after Second World War. The other thing, you also mentioned the Pershman, the museum that I also know that was kind of instituted by a lot of voluntary work in this Partisan and Verband, also like in Carinthian, right? And it is quite symptomatic that this history is not well covered in historical textbooks, and that there is none like kind of museum that would really, I don't know, in Vienna or something, have a really longer section of this important chapter of European Austrian history.
Any other comments or questions?
Sorry, just like a small comment, and it comes from today's conference, and somehow I kind of see like if a partisan anti-fascist work didn't continue to anti-colonial practice or a political practice, this kind of heritage disappears and somehow. So it's a kind of a political engagement that continues in many ways. It's not enough to be anti-fascist to become partisan in many ways, no? I mean, I'm wondering, because that's what I kind of get from this discussion and presentation we had today from different places. So, and especially like seeing, okay, the partisan in Yugoslavia, it all went to this non-alignment heritage. In France, also with the anti-colonial, with the Algerian struggle. which is, I also find this partisan term, it's a very European term in many ways, because you don't see that partisan thing, for example, and it's totally related for anti-fascists. You don't see it in Palestine or in Chile or in China, for example. That's only just a comment, a continuation, and somehow, sorry.
I just wanted to ask a very quick question, because you were saying when you responded to one of the questions that it was about the language and the conclusion being anti-fascist, but the racial element. I mean, at the time, obviously, we weren't talking about, of course we were, but the racial element of appartenance, belonging. How do you make that distinction between a family that just wanted to live its life and wanted to speak its language and wanted to be who they are, and once obstructed from being that, does that immediately mean anti-fascist?
I'm not sure if I got the question well. If
It's the distinction
yeah.
between racial belonging and wanting to confirm that
Mm-hmm.
and anti-fascist. Anti-fascist is a very clear political commitment.
I think those kind of distinctions afterwards, like after people fought against fascism, don't make so much sense. To look afterwards, what did they exactly fight for? Because the result was that it, maybe I didn't get your question well, but because I think those questions afterwards, is this now, can we label this?
One is social and the other is ideological.
The problem is for that who doesn't know it, that when fascists came to the power, they made 3 laws. The first one was for them who was against the regime, the fascist regime, fascist politics. The second war was against them who doesn't want not to go to front. And the third one was the general criminals. To them were included like Jews and gypsies who lives of the crime. The Jews were mostly persecuted for the financial crimes and the drugs handle, the drugs commerce. The gypsies, like the who steals, yeah. Well, the truth is that it was a racial selection. You can find that placards or that placards, what it is? Yes, posters about who is the first race, who is the second race, who is third race, who is mixed. In internet you can find them. So I don't think that Slovenians, like a lady looks like, that she was included to the, maybe to the mixed, because not, not German in a classical way. So that's why, for example, me as Russian, I was included to the, I think to the second class. It was some classes, I think 8 of them. So, but the question about that, why he was persecuted, because he want not to return to the front. Yes, and between for the first law, many Austrians, even the officers were persited, and we have even the monument near the quartier of the president, that X, the big X, near the Volksgarten. So that's why. Because not all the Austrians supported the fascism, many were against. And many even officers were unfortunately finished in jail for that reason.
Was there any other comments or questions?
Yeah, it's not terribly important, but this question of partisan being a vocabulary that is often circulating within the histories of Europe, which continues to frame the histories of the world, so much so that other kinds of violence from the 1940s get overwritten by the violence in Europe. And how does solidarity inhabit both the violence in Europe and the violence more broadly? And I'm thinking about how, and I loved the film, and it reminded me so much of families now, maybe like your family, who have seen these narratives of partisan, uncles who lost their lives in the 70s, tied to the way Maoist revolution spread. And that had such strong echoes in the imaginary of the guerrilla fighter, so across the world. And the part of the world I come from, every family had one or two members who were tied to the far left, not the Communist Party of India, which had split into 1,000 parts by then, by late 1960s, but belonging to the Communist Party Maoist, who are still banned in India. They have war against the state. They're persecuted, and they're persecuted by the Communist Party of India, Marxist. So, and there was tremendous violence unleashed onto them, so much so, who is the partisan became a big question within the left. And I think globally there is a history to be written through transnational work, I think, about Maoism and how this rhetoric of the bandit, and they were called bandits, how families split, how memories were contested. It's not my specialization. There are people in literature working on them, filmmakers like you who are returning to the topic and going back, interviewing grandparents and interviewing, and there is so much silence. And that's what I initially wanted to ask you. It's quite fascinating, your conversation with your grandmother. And I'm just thinking, were there silences that she would not, are there things that she would not want to talk about? Is it a flow of emotion, or is there restriction to what one will say? Or is it a memory that flows freely, or is it a memory, or rather, is it an emotion that flows freely as narrative, or are there chunks of difficulties and gaps? And have you thought about that as you continue to explore this issue? But thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I think for my grandmother, she was special in this, not special, but a lot of people didn't talk about it. And for her, I can't really explain the reasons why, but she did. She did talk about it. But like, for example, my cousins told me after they watched the film, we've heard this for the first time. But I was thinking, it's strange they heard this for the first time, because it's not, she never hid it. And she would talk about it fluently, and there was never the fact that she said, no, I can't tell you this, or, I mean, if she didn't remember, she didn't remember, but she had a good remembrance usually, and no, she liked to talk about it, and it was important for her, but it's, I think, it's like my cousins didn't know anything about it, so it seems like maybe they didn't ask so much, but she was prepared to talk about it. But I know other cases, and for other films, like there's a woman who was in Ravensbrück. Her family didn't, they supported their brothers who all deserted from Wehrmacht, and that's why she came as a very, very young woman to Ravensbrück. And she started talking about it very late, in the 80s. And before that, she didn't talk about it. And I think this is special in the situation in Austria too, because like after so many traumatizing things happen, concentration camps, you lose your family, then the situation was not like, okay, we recognize what happened to you, and it was horrible, and you lost relatives, and it was not right what happened to you. But the situation was different. It was like it was your own fault. You were bandits. You didn't fight for the right thing, or you fought for either you fought for communism, or you. There was so the atmosphere was still so full of hatred, and there were still people killed in the years after the war. And if there was Slovene gatherings, there would people come and throw stones and. I think there, So this made it especially difficult, I think, to talk about it in this atmosphere. Yeah.
Someone in the back, yeah.
Can you understand me? I wanted to thank you, Andrina, because I liked it very much, this film. And one should not forget that in Austria there was a very special situation, which is not comparable to the situation that lady described for India. Because the basis for the state of, for the Second Republic, for the Second Austrian Republic was being the first victim of National Socialism, which was in a way true and in another way not, because all the Austrians, they loved it to be part of the Reich after 1933. And the partisans were never, and the Slovenian partisans especially, were never recognized as political victims of National Socialism. That was very hard, because they were called Banditen. And so I think this is, but due to the Slovenian part of partisans, their fight, Austria could become this Second Republic. And they were never recognized. And even, I mean, that's Austrian politics, but the deserters were not recognized as victims, or they were just not recognized, and they were never recompensated. It took many, many years to be recompensated, and until this monument in front of the Kanzleramt was erected. It was a long fight. And I think one should never forget that it was such a long way. And on the other hand, of course, in Carinthia itself, all the old Nazis, they were in power. And I'm a medical doctor, and I was working at the psychiatry department in Vienna, and there was a lady as a patient, and she was born in a concentration camp. She was a Slovenian. She was one of the babies of a concentration camp, born there, and her doctor in Carinthia was Mr. Skrinzi, if you know him. He was one of the biggest Nazis here in Austria, part of the FPÖ, and he was in the parliament. So I mean, that was a terrible situation. All the Nazis, they came back to power, and the partisans, the fighters, they were pulled down. And I think this is a very special situation.
Thank you for this
now,
comment.
may I tell you something which probably many of the audience don't know? When there is every year at 8th of May a big liberation ceremony in Mauthausen. And this year, the ÖVP, our ruling party of our chancellor, they said they won't take part in this liberation ceremony because it's just red flags there. They don't want to take part. And I think that's disgusting, really, and it shows the situation here in this country.
Thank you very much. This is a very important comment to also situate the effort and why it was really important for us to discuss all of these topics. I think we would wrap it up if there are no more immediate questions or comments that are really urgent. No? Andrina, is there something else that you would like to add?
Maybe because it was just said, but yeah, it's true that it was an important part that the fight of the partisans helped of Austria to sign the state treaty, den Staatsvertrag, 1955, in which it was said that Austria helped itself to free it, and it was kind of a victim because of the fight of the partisans. So it was really important for the Staatsvertrag, for the state treaty, the fight of the partisans, but they never got any thanks for it.
But I'm also, before kind of concluding on a positive note also, because I think we will kind of continue in the evening with the really joyous musical celebration of thinking about partisanship, I also want to stress that, it was important for us to show Andrina's film because it really talks about this kind of deep traumatical spot in Austrian history. But I also want to say that, there is a number of artists also working, especially on these elements in terms of how all of these heavy stories are remembered in the public space. And I think there is more and more voices, here locally who are also asking, for writing different stories, for insisting on different set of values. And this is also why this seminar was important for us, because we wanted to contribute that debate, because as it was mentioned many times during these 2 days, we also need all of those histories and knowledge and shared experience to be very much strong about what we are fighting for in today. And we hope that all of what we had and shared in these 2 days is also maybe a little contribution to that. So thank you all again very much. And just a reminder that we are back here for Arkady Kotz's concert at 8:30. Thank you.